The storm silenced her heartbeat. Then a human whispered her back to life. The frozen echo, the mountain peaks of the Whispering Range had earned their name from the way wind danced through their jagged summits, creating haunting melodies that echoed across the valleys below. But tonight, there was no gentle whisper, only the savage roar of a storm unlike any the region had witnessed in living memory. Nira pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, her weathered hands gripping the stone so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath her thick gloves. She had guided travelers through these treacherous paths for over a decade, had weathered countless storms, and navigated through conditions that would send seasoned mountaineers fleeing back to civilization. Yet this blizzard was different. It felt alive, malevolent, as if it bore a personal grudge against anyone foolish enough to venture into its domain. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps, each exhalation forming crystals that immediately froze to her scarf. The wind struck her like physical blows, threatening to tear her from her meager shelter and hurl her into the abyss below. She had been caught in the open when the storm descended with supernatural swiftness, transforming a clear mountain afternoon into a white hell in mere minutes. The cold was seeping through her layers now, despite her heavy coat and thermal gear. She could feel it creeping up from her extremities, first her toes, then her fingers, a numbness that spoke of something far more dangerous than mere discomfort. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs with the exertion and fear, began to slow. Each beat felt labored, as if her very life force was being drained away by the merciless cold. Nira knew the signs. She had seen hypothermia claim other climbers, had watched the subtle way death crept in through freezing flesh. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had saved so many others from the mountain's wrath now found herself at its mercy. Not like this, she whispered through chattering teeth. But even her voice seemed swallowed by the storm's fury. Miles away in the valley below, nestled in a grove of ancient pines that provided shelter from the worst of the wind, stood a small cabin that most travelers never noticed. It blended so seamlessly with its surroundings that it seemed less built than grown from the landscape itself. Inside, surrounded by bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and shelves lined with mysterious bottles and jars, Thane jolted, awake from a deep sleep. The vision had been so vivid, so real, that for a moment he couldn't distinguish it from reality. He had seen her, a woman with dark hair whipped by wind, her face pale with cold, her lips moving in silent desperation. But it was her eyes that haunted him most, dark and fierce, fighting against an encroaching darkness that threatened to claim her entirely. Thane had always been different. The villagers in the valley knew him as a healer, someone who could cure ailments that baffled the town's physician, who could ease pain with just the touch of his hands. What they didn't know was that his gift went deeper than herb lore and natural remedies. Sometimes he could sense things, injuries, illnesses, people in distress, even from great distances. Tonight, that sense screamed at him with urgent intensity. Rose from his bed, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor as he moved to the window. The storm raged beyond the glass, but through it all he could feel her presence like a beacon of fading warmth in an ocean of ice. She was dying. He was certain of it with the same certainty that told him when someone's fever would break or when a wound would heal cleanly. Without hesitation, Thane began to dress. Heavy boots, thick coat, wool-lined gloves, gear he had hoped never to need on a night like this. He gathered supplies, blankets, a thermos of hot tea brewed with herbs that could help combat hypothermia, and small packets of warming salts that could provide emergency heat. His neighbors would call him mad for venturing out in such conditions. But Thane had learned long ago to trust the pull of his unusual gift. The moment he stepped outside, the storm tried to drive him back. Wind strong enough to uproot trees slammed into him, and the cold bit through his layers like teeth. But Thane pressed forward, guided by something deeper than logic or reason. Each step was a battle, each breath a victory against the storms, attempt to claim another victim. The path up the mountain was treacherous under the best conditions. Tonight, it was nearly impassable. Snow had drifted into barriers taller than a man, and the wind had scoured other sections down to bare ice. Thane climbed steadily, his unusual sensitivity to life force growing stronger with each step upward. She was close now, so close he could almost hear her heartbeat, faint and growing fainter. He found her huddled against a rock face, nearly buried in snow that had accumulated around her still form. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. Her face was pale as the snow around her, her lips tinged with the blue of severe hypothermia. But when he knelt beside her and placed his bare hand against her throat, he felt it, the barest flutter of pulse, weak but persistent. "I've got you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "You're going to be all right." Thane worked quickly but carefully. First, he brushed the snow away from her body, then wrapped her in the emergency blankets he had carried up. The mountain. The warming salts went into her gloves and boots, providing immediate heat to her extremities. But it was when he placed his hands directly on her skin that something remarkable happened. A gentle warmth flowed from his palms, not the harsh heat of fever, but something deeper and more sustaining. It was his gift manifesting in its purest form, the ability to share his own life force with another who desperately needed it. Color began to return to Neera's cheeks, and her breathing, which had been so shallow as to be nearly undetectable, grew stronger and more regular. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and confused, but undeniably alive. When they focused on his face, he saw recognition there, not of him specifically, but of salvation itself. "Who?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Thane," he said gently, continuing to channel warmth into her chilled body. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." The journey back down the mountain was harrowing. Thane half-carried, half-guided Neera through the worst of the storm, his body serving as a windbreak and his strange gift providing continuous warmth to keep hypothermia at bay. By the time they reached his cabin, both were exhausted, but Neera's heartbeat had steadied into a strong, regular rhythm. Inside the warm sanctuary of his home, Thane settled Neera beside the fire and prepared hot tea with herbs specifically chosen to combat the lingering effects of extreme cold exposure. As she sipped the warming brew, color fully returned to her face, and the awful blueness faded from her lips. "You came for me," she said finally, her voice still rough but growing stronger. "How did you know?" Thane settled into the chair across from her, studying this woman whose distress had called to him across miles of mountain wilderness. "I felt you dying," he said simply. "I couldn't let that happen." Something passed between them in that moment, and understanding that went beyond mere gratitude. The storm still raged outside, but within the cabin's walls, two souls had found an unexpected connection forged in the crucible of survival and mysterious purpose. The heart's thaw dawn broke gray and muted over the whispering mountains, the storm having finally exhausted itself after 3 days of relentless fury. Neera stood at Thane's window, watching the weak sunlight struggle through lingering clouds, but her reflection in the glass troubled her more than the weather. Her eyes, once bright with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains like old friends, now held shadows that hadn't been there before the storm. "You're troubled," Thane observed from behind her, setting down 2 cups of his healing tea on the small wooden table. The herbs, winterberry, frost mint, and something else she couldn't identify, sent curls of fragrant steam into the morning air. Neera turned from the window, accepting the offered warmth gratefully. 3 days in his care had restored her physical strength, but something deeper remained unsettled. "That storm," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the fear that had been growing in her chest since she'd first opened her eyes in his. Cabin. It wasn't natural, Thane finished quietly. I felt it too. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Nira had spent her life in these mountains, had weathered every variety of storm nature could devise, but what had nearly claimed her life bore the fingerprints of something far older and more malevolent than mere weather patterns. My grandmother used to tell stories, Nira said, settling into the chair across from him. Legends about the frost wraith, an ancient spirit bound to these peaks centuries ago by mountain shamans who feared its power. She said it could only touch the world during the deepest winter storms, that it sought a human vessel to anchor it permanently to our realm. Thane's hands tightened around his cup. And you think it's chosen you? It wasn't a question. Over the past 3 days, as Nira had recovered her strength, Thane had noticed the changes, the way frost formed on surfaces she touched for too long. How the temperature in the room dropped when she was deeply asleep. Most unsettling of all, the way his healing gift had to work constantly just to keep her core temperature stable, as if something was actively trying to drain the warmth from her body. I can feel it, Nira whispered, her breath visible despite the cabin's warmth. Like ice in my veins, growing stronger each day. It's using me as an anchor point, and once it's fully established, she didn't need to finish. They both understood the implications. Thane leaned forward, his unusual gift allowing him to sense the supernatural cold that was slowly claiming her from within. But beneath that alien frost, he could still feel her, Nira's essential warmth, her fierce spirit fighting against the encroaching darkness. There has to be a way to break the connection. The old stories speak of a ritual, Nira said, standing abruptly and beginning to pace. The original shamans bound the wraith at the heart of the mountains, in a place called the Howling Sanctuary. Legend says the binding can only be broken by someone willing to face the spirit directly, to either become its permanent vessel or destroy it entirely. The weight of unspoken understanding settled between them. Nira was proposing to return to the very place where the wraith was strongest, to confront an entity that had already partially claimed her. It was, by any reasonable measure, suicide. You're not going alone, Thane said with quiet finality. Thane, you don't understand. Your gift, it's tied to life and warmth. The sanctuary will try to drain that from you the moment you set foot in it. I won't be responsible for your death. But Thane was already moving, gathering supplies with the same methodical certainty that had driven him into the storm to save her 3 nights ago. My gift isn't just about healing, he said, pulling thick coats from a cedar chest. It's about connection, sharing life force, creating bonds between living things. If the wraith is trying to use you as an anchor to this world, then maybe I can serve as your anchor to humanity. The journey to the Howling Sanctuary took them higher into the mountains than Nira had ever guided anyone before. The paths here were unmarked, known only through oral tradition and half-remembered legends. As they climbed, the temperature dropped far below what the altitude alone could account for, and Nira's condition worsened. Frost began forming in her hair, and her breath came out as visible clouds, even when they stopped to rest in sheltered areas. But Thane stayed close, his hands finding hers whenever the supernatural cold grew too intense, his gift pushing warmth into her system and keeping the wraith's influence at bay. They moved as one entity up the treacherous slopes, connected by threads of shared life force that grew stronger with each passing hour. The Howling Sanctuary revealed itself as they crested a final ridge, a natural amphitheater carved into the living rock of the mountain's peak, its walls rising in smooth curves that seemed designed to channel and amplify sound. At its center stood a pillar of black ice that had never melted, not even during the warmest summers. Ancient symbols were carved into its surface, and around its base lay the bones of creatures that had wandered too close to the Wraith's prison. Over the centuries. "It's beautiful," Nira breathed, and Thane realized with growing alarm that her voice carried no warmth at all. The moment they entered the sanctuary, the temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the stone floor with each of Nira's footsteps, and the ice pillar began to emit a low, harmonic hum that seemed to resonate in their very bones. But it was Nira's transformation that truly terrified Thane. Her skin took on the pale translucency of deep ice, and when she looked at him, her eyes had become the color of winter storms. "Can you feel it calling?" she asked, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. "The peace of eternal cold? The silence of endless winter?" Thane grabbed her hands, pouring every ounce of his healing gift into the connection between them. "Fight it, Nira. Remember who you are. Remember the warmth." For a moment, her eyes cleared, and she was herself again. "Now," she gasped, "while I can still choose." Together, they approached the ice pillar. Ancient words in a language neither of them fully understood poured from Nira's lips, the binding ritual spoken in reverse, an incantation to either free the Wraith or destroy it entirely. The pillar began to crack, and from within came a sound like the death cry of glaciers, a wail of rage and hunger that had been building for centuries. The Frost Wraith emerged not as a visible entity, but as pure winter made manifest. The temperature dropped so rapidly that their breath froze in their lungs, and ice began forming on their skin faster than Thane's gift could counter it. This was cold beyond the merely physical. It was the absence of all warmth, all life, all hope. Nira stepped forward to meet it, and Thane felt their connection stretching to its breaking point as the Wraith tried to claim her completely. But instead of letting go, he stepped forward, too, wrapping his arms around her from behind and channeling not just his healing gift, but his very life force into her body. "Together," he whispered in her ear and felt her nod. What followed was a battle fought not with weapons, but with the fundamental forces of existence itself. The Wraith poured its ancient cold into Nira, trying to freeze her heart and make her its permanent vessel. But Thane countered every attack with warmth, with life, with the unbreakable connection he had forged with this remarkable woman. The turning point came when Nira, supported by Thane's unwavering presence, began to push back. Instead of merely resisting the Wraith's cold, she began to transform it, using her guide's knowledge of the mountains to redirect the entity's power back into the stone and ice where it belonged. The sanctuary filled with the sound of shattering ice as the ancient binding reasserted itself. But this time it was different. Not a prison, but a natural integration of the Wraith's essence with the mountain itself. When the battle ended, the black ice pillar had become clear crystal, and the oppressive cold had lifted. Nira collapsed into Thane's arms, her skin warm and alive, her eyes their natural dark brown once again. "Is it over?" she asked weakly. Thane pressed his ear to her chest, listening to the strong, steady rhythm of her heartbeat, no longer fading, no longer fighting against supernatural cold, but beating with the vibrant pulse of someone fully alive. "It's over," he confirmed, helping her to her feet. As they made their way back down the mountain, Thane realized that something fundamental had changed between them. The connection forged in crisis had become something deeper, a bond that would endure long after the memory of supernatural cold had faded. Nira's heartbeat, which the storm had nearly silenced forever, now beat in harmony with his own. The Whispering Mountains had gained a new legend that day, not of ancient curses or malevolent spirits, but of two people who had found in each other the strength to face the impossible and emerge not just victorious, but transformed. And in the valley below, spring came early that year, as if the land itself celebrated the triumph of warmth over endless winter. The whispered promise 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the Howling Sanctuary, and the Whispering Mountains had settled into a rhythm unlike any in recorded memory. Where once the peaks had been known for their treacherous weather and mysterious disappearances, they now drew visitors from across the continent. Healers seeking to understand the strange warmth that emanated from the highest elevations, and lovers who claimed that vows spoken in the mountain's embrace were blessed with unbreakable bonds. Nira stood at the edge of her newly built lodge, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The structure was unlike anything that had existed in these mountains before, part-way station for travelers, part healing sanctuary, and part home for the two souls who had discovered that some connections transcend the ordinary boundaries of human experience. The Meridian party should reach the third waypoint today, Thane said, joining her on the wooden deck with 2 cups of his morning blend. The tea had evolved since their adventure, now incorporating herbs that seemed to grow only in the spots where their combined life force had been strongest during the battle with the Wraith. Nira accepted the cup gratefully, still marveling at how perfectly their daily rhythms had synchronized. Mrs. Caldwell's arthritis should respond well to the mineral springs up there, and young Marcus— She paused, sensing something through the connection that had never quite faded after the sanctuary. His lung condition isn't natural, is it? Thane's expression grew serious. No, there's something else at work. Not malevolent like the Wraith, but ancient. Something tied to the old places. This had become their new reality. The battle with the Frost Wraith had done more than save Nira and break an ancient curse. It had awakened both of them to a larger world of supernatural forces that existed in the margins of everyday life. Their combined abilities, her intuitive understanding of the land's hidden currents and his gift for healing and life force manipulation, had made them inadvertent guardians of a much larger territory than either had ever imagined. The lodge they had built together served multiple purposes. To most visitors, it appeared to be simply an upscale mountain retreat where Nira guided expeditions and Thane treated various ailments with his renowned herbal remedies. But to those who knew how to look, it was something far more significant, a sanctuary where the supernatural and mundane worlds could coexist peacefully. "We have another visitor coming," Nira said suddenly, her enhanced senses picking up a disturbance in the natural patterns far below. "Someone desperate." Thane sat down his cup and closed his eyes, extending his awareness down the mountain paths. After a moment, he nodded grimly. "A young woman. She's been running for days, maybe weeks. There's something hunting her." Without needing to discuss it, they began preparing. This, too, had become routine. The arrival of people fleeing from supernatural, threats they couldn't understand, drawn to the lodge by instincts they couldn't explain. Word had spread through certain circles about the mountain healers who could deal with problems that conventional wisdom couldn't touch. The woman who stumbled into their clearing 3 hours later was barely more than a girl, perhaps 20, with wild auburn hair and eyes that held the particular kind of terror that came from witnessing impossible things. Her clothes were torn from days of rough travel, and she moved with the jerky paranoid motions of someone who expected attack from any direction. "Please," she gasped, collapsing to her knees in the snow. They said you could help with things that shouldn't exist." Nira was beside her instantly, wrapping the girl in a warm cloak, while Thane began his preliminary assessment. The moment his hands touched her shoulders, he recoiled slightly. The girl wasn't just frightened, she was marked by something that made the Frost Wraith seem almost benign by comparison. "What's your name?" Nira asked, gently helping the girl to her feet. "Vera," she whispered. "Vera Blackthorn. I'm from Millhaven, 3 days south of here. Something has been following me since the autumn equinox. It wears different faces, speaks with different voices, but it's always the same presence underneath. Thane and Nira exchanged glances. They had encountered shapeshifters before, but this description suggested something far more dangerous, a type of entity that fed on identity itself, slowly replacing its victims piece by piece, until nothing of the original person remained. "Show us," Nira said simply. What Vera revealed over the next hour, in the safety of their lodge's warded interior, painted a picture of a supernatural predator, unlike anything in their growing catalog of mountain spirits and ancient curses. The entity had first appeared, to her as a childhood friend who had died years earlier, then as her deceased grandmother, and finally as a perfect copy of herself. Each encounter had left Vera feeling diminished, as if parts of her essence had been drained away. "It's getting stronger," Vera whispered, unconsciously touching a pendant at her throat. A family heirloom that seemed to be the only thing preventing complete possession. "And I'm getting weaker. Sometimes I look in mirrors and don't recognize the person looking back." Thane had been taking notes in a journal that had grown considerably thicker over the past months. Their encounters with supernatural entities were becoming more frequent and more complex, as if their victory over the Frost Wraith had somehow marked them as beacons for others in need. "The pendant," Nira observed. "It's more than just silver, isn't it?" Vera nodded. "My great-grandmother was different. People whispered that she had the sight, that she could see things others couldn't. She made this for protection against the hungry shadows, as she called them." Thane looked up from his notes. "Your great-grandmother was probably what we'd call a wardsmith, someone who could create objects that interact with supernatural forces. The pendant is keeping the entity from completing its harvest, but it's not strong enough to banish it permanently." "Can you help me?" Vera asked, and both Nira and Thane could hear the desperation in her voice. The answer wasn't simple. The entity pursuing Vera, what Thane's research suggested was called a doppelhunger, was far more dangerous than the geographically bound Frost Wraith. This creature could follow its prey anywhere, and traditional methods of banishment required resources and expertise they didn't possess. But that night, as they planned their approach, Nira made a discovery that changed everything. "The pendant isn't just protecting her," she said, studying the silver charm under a magnifying glass. "It's been recording everything, every encounter, every energy signature, every time the entity tried to feed." Thane looked up from the ancient texts he'd been consulting. "Recording how?" "Like a memory crystal. Your great-grandmother was more than just ward-wise, Vera. She was a chronicler, someone who could trap experiences in physical objects. This pendant contains a complete map of the entity's nature and weaknesses." What followed was the most complex, supernatural working either Nira or Thane had ever attempted. Using the pendant as a guide, they created a trap that would force the doppelhunger to reveal its true form, stripping away its stolen identities and leaving it vulnerable to banishment. The confrontation took place at midnight in a circle of standing stones that Nira had discovered high on the mountain, another remnant of the ancient shamanic traditions that had once kept the supernatural world in balance. When the entity arrived, wearing Vera's face but with eyes like empty mirrors, it found not a helpless victim, but a carefully prepared battleground. The battle was unlike their fight with the Frost Wraith, where that had been a contest of opposing forces, cold versus warmth. This was a more subtle war of identities and truths. The doppelhunger tried to confuse them by taking on their own appearances, but the connection between Nira and Thane had grown strong enough that they could sense each other's authentic presence, even when their eyes were deceived. The turning point came when Vera, empowered by the protective circle and guided by her great-grandmother's pendant, spoke the entity's true name, a sound like breaking glass and empty wind that stripped away all its stolen faces at once. Revealed in its actual form, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger, the doppelhunger was vulnerable to the banishment ritual Thane had prepared. As dawn broke over the standing stones, the entity dissolved into morning mist, finally released from its endless feeding cycle. Vera collapsed but alive, her own identity fully restored and no longer under supernatural threat. "How can I ever repay you?" she asked as they made their way back to the lodge. "By living," Nira said simply. "By being fully, authentically yourself. That's what these entities fear most, people who know exactly who they are." As Vera departed the next morning, her pendant now glowing with protective power, rather than just recorded memories, Thane and Nira stood together on their deck, watching her disappear down the mountain path. "We're becoming something new, aren't we?" Nira observed. "Not just healers or guides, but guardians of the boundary between worlds." Thane nodded, pulling her closer as a cool mountain breeze reminded them both of how far they'd come since that first supernatural storm. "The mountains called us together for a reason. Maybe this is what we were always meant to become." Their lodge had indeed become more than a simple retreat. It was evolving into a sanctuary for those caught between the mundane and magical worlds, a place where ancient wisdom and modern compassion could work together to maintain the delicate balance that kept both realms safe. And as the sun climbed higher over the whispering mountains, painting their peaks in brilliant gold, two heartbeats continued their synchronized rhythm, no longer just surviving the supernatural, but thriving as its guardians, their love having become the foundation for something larger and more important than either had ever imagined possible. The mountains whispered their approval in the morning wind, and somewhere in the harmony of that sound, new legends were already beginning to take shape.